Movies. I am your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, Jackson Keller.
Or are you Sean McKinda and I'm Jackson Keller?
Listen, kid, here's the rub. I'm Sean McKinda, and you are too. He's the both of us, together.
Oh. So this podcast is effectively us vying for control over a single entity.
We've been talking to ourselves the entire time, but turns out you're a really good voice actor, so people haven't noticed yet.
Hey, hire me? I don't have a job right now.
We got a Patreon.
We're talking about Psycho. Hitchcock month does continue. Sean continues to be, I was gonna say deflowered, but I don't like that. So I'm gonna go ahead and say Sean continues to learn new things about movies he should have seen.
You know what? You could have just said deflowered. Yes, and we're doing a big, great, important canon with a capital C film today. The most famous Hitchcock movie of them all, perhaps. Though I'm gonna steal a line because Red Letter Media actually has a good review series on Psycho and its sequels, which sounds shockingly interesting. Like, I would assume that a sequel to a Hitchcock movie not made by Hitchcock. I mean, Hitchcock didn't do sequels, but like, you know what I mean. Like, you would assume they would be garbage, but they actually sound interesting.
I didn't even know that there were sequels to Psycho until our pre-discussion.
And so I'm gonna steal something from their discussion of the original movie, and say that this is a movie that is well respected and well regarded and well known and groundbreaking, but you'd be hard pressed to find someone who says it's their favorite Hitchcock movie, and that is myself included. I think it is a great movie, but unlike with Rear Window, where when I watched it again, I had even more appreciation for it. With this one, most of what's interesting to talk about Psycho is indeed the stuff that's been talked about to death. And as a movie, I think that the first half before the twist, everyone knows this movie, but we'll still do spoilers in case there are people who aren't, because I think that's an interesting part of this discussion. Before, like, the first major twist, I really, really liked the movie up until then, but after, it's not that it falls apart, but I was definitely looking at my phone more.
No, I will agree. I think the beginning of it has an almost Tarantino vibe to it in a lot of ways, and one that I really, really liked. It felt very kind of loose and experimental and kind of blazing its own trail in a lot of ways. And then afterwards, it did kind of become a little bit more formulaic. And to say this is formulaic is kind of doing it a disservice, given that it functionally set up the formula. But being 60 years removed from its release and having watched other films inspired by it and just being around the zeitgeist, you can't help but be like, I've seen this before, just in any number of other movies.
Yeah, like, there's a lot of unique stuff in the first half. I think that our main character and Norman Bates are both really interesting characters, and that is one thing I really like about this movie. I do think that Norman is one of, like, the great movie characters for a reason. I think that Tony Perkins' performance is magnificent. I think that the character as written, although the twists with, like, what he's about are very, very well known, I still think that they're interesting, and they really show off how Hitchcock, another thing that made Hitchcock sort of special that is maybe a little underappreciated that we can talk about. But, like, so I think the first part of the movie, up to and including the twist, is really effective. And then the second part of the movie is just, like, at that point, like, there are shots that I like there's a lot of famous stuff in the movie and a lot of great visuals and all that good stuff, but it just, you have a really interesting character dynamic that just isn't present in the second half.
As I said, it all kind of changes in the second half and becomes far more what you would expect it to be. And I think that's why you find yourself kind of drifting away from it, because you, again, 60 years down the road, you know the beats of the movie at that point. It's hard to stay engaged when you've seen so many other movies do this, and not to knock the craft, but you've seen them do it better. And that's, again, not saying that Hitchcock did this poorly, but, you know, you learn, you iterate, you get better at what's going on. So, like, as much of a trendsetter as Hitchcock was, and as well as he did it, there have just been better versions of it done since then.
Yeah, and I mean, this has sort of been, I think, more so than any other movie, because, you know, Rear Window, Vertigo, North by Northwest, Dial M for Murder, The Birds, like, these are all more films that don't have quite the same cultural baggage that this one does. And so I was really curious. I kind of had to choose when making my syllabus between this and North by Northwest, because although I prefer North by Northwest by a great amount, one, I didn't think Sean would be as into it, and two, this is just, I think that if you are a film buff, you should watch it. I don't think you'll regret watching it. But it definitely, like, the question that I sort of had was, so how much, because the movie is so famous, like, kind of back to the quarantine classic question, like, how much is it worth sort of revisiting and seeing for yourself as a movie? And I think that first half has a lot to offer, but by the second half, you're left kind of only with the historical context and the craft. And the other thing, the other more specific variant that we have is, how much is it worth watching if you know all of the beats already? Because even if you don't watch a ton of slasher movies, you know, this is considered the first slasher, there's a good chance that you already know all the plot twists anyway, because they've become so culturally ingrained. Like, the character dynamic that Norman has with his mother has become like shorthand for like creepy psychosexual, like, incest sort of thing. And it's hard to get away from that. And so I was wondering, because I knew basically every beat of the movie going in, I was not sure how much Sean knew and how that would have impacted his viewing. So, Sean, how much did you know going in?
Well, but before I dive into that, I want to posit a quick theory that just kind of came up while you were talking about it. And it does actually relate to how much I knew about it going in, which is to say, I knew the iconic scene, the shot that everyone knows, the shot that everyone thinks of when you hear the word psycho. That was about all I knew of the movie. I feel like a lot of the other stuff I pieced together as I was watching, which could be part of just knowing Psycho, like being around slasher films. It could be part of just, you know, slowly absorbing it just through the zeitgeist inadvertently. There's any number of reasons why I was able to piece together the movie so much quicker, I feel like, than initial audiences were. That said, the first half, I knew almost nothing about it, and I wonder if that's why the first half feels more interesting as well, because the first half doesn't get talked about as much. Like, the initial, what kickstarts everything going on here, I was not prepared for. I was not prepared for, like, the David Fincher long driving scenes through nights and whatnot. That was not what I was prepared to be a part of with this. And then, you know, it took off in the way that Psycho does, but I had no idea what was coming in the first half, and I think that's why I kept so much more attention with the first half of the movie.
I think it's an interesting thought, because I definitely agree. I think part of that is just, I'm also going to steal. It's so hard to not to talk about what makes the second half less enjoyable without spoilers, so I might hold my tongue on this one, actually, unless we have any, because it's really hard to talk about, like, what made this movie unique and what made this movie, like, important without spoilers. So I'm gonna propose, unless you have another like non-spoiler point you can bring up, since this is such a famous movie that most people probably know the spoilers to anyway. I would propose that we move into that quicker than usual.
I'm fine with that. I do just want to kind of give my quick thoughts on the movie as a whole, because I think that to be self-important, I think they're kind of interesting in that I going into this was weird, and I'm worried that this is going to kind of influence the rest of Hitchcock month, because I feel like going into Rear Window, I was in this headspace. Going into this, I was a little bit in this headspace. Vertigo might be the one that I'm in the right headspace for it, because I know literally nothing about that movie. I think I'm familiar with one scene of a man looking down off a rooftop, and I don't even know if that's from Vertigo. I think it is. I'm not positive. But I think I go into these movies knowing just enough to be dangerous around them, but not enough to make the context surrounding the movie interesting. So, like, with this, again, I go into knowing pretty much everything that goes along with the back half of the movie, either through osmosis or through just actually being aware of it. And so that part loses my interest. But I don't know enough about Hitchcock that, like, I can watch it and be like, okay, this is where this started happening. This is this influence, yada, 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 yada. So while I still enjoyed the movie and thought it was good, I was kind of left like, okay, cool. I watched Psycho now. I don't know what I'm going to talk about with it, because watching this movie felt not hollow, but like a chip. Like I ate it, I liked it, but now it's gone, and only a faint memory of it remains, which is unfortunate, because it is a good movie. It's very influential, but I think I have just like that perfect knowledge in that, like, I know too much about the movie itself that it lessens a lot of the impacts, and I don't know enough about the social context around it that I don't get the extra bits from there.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable take. And as far as the rest of Hitchcock month, I mean, it is just possible that, like, the director's style you just don't vibe with as much. I suspect you'll get more out of Vertigo, even if you don't love it, than you have for these previous two films. Because the thing about Psycho that's weird is that it's kind of an oddball in Hitchcock's voix, because it's atypical in a lot of ways, in a lot of important ways, which of course I will, point out and talk about. In that, like, it's his most famous movie up there with The Birds, but again, both of them, as I said last week, very much not super indicative of the rest of his work. I think this is more indicative than The Birds, probably. I haven't rewatched The Birds in a long time either. So it's definitely still very much a Hitchcock movie, but I think that part of that airiness, part of that, like, I'll take a potato chip and eat it, being gone, I think some of that is by design, and that requires me to spill the deets, the famous deets about the historical context, which is, like, the most important and like, interesting part of the movie in the absence of talking about the movie itself. So,
spoilers then?
Yes. Let's do it. Let's get right into it.
Well, before we do, I have to push that back just a little bit more so I can propose some ads for you. They're not really ads. They're short little things to tell us about us. Next week, we're going to be talking about Vertigo. Fingers crossed I get more engaged with that one. Follow us on Twitter at BADH_cast. Support us on Patreon, patreon.com/BADHcast. Jackson Keller on YouTube. You should go subscribe to that. We're uploading our episodes there. He's doing a little bit of work on them to make them a little bit prettier. I think that's what we usually talk about here. I don't think I'm missing anything.
Nope, we got it.
Spoilers, let's do it.
So, the fundamental problem, I guess before we get into, like, the historical context, the fundamental problem with the movie is that it kills off its second most interesting character halfway through it, and doesn't replace it with anyone nearly as interesting. So Janet Leigh, Marion Crane, pretty remarkable character in a lot of ways, especially for the time. And, like, you really it does a good job of getting you invested in her story, which what makes her getting like gut like a hog in the shower all the more shocking. And of course that's the point, which is great. I love me like a false lead decoy protagonist. I've sung the praises of a certain anime that spans multiple generations for this reason. And I think that what doesn't work here is that in said anime, the following protagonist is more interesting than the one that we left behind. Whereas the characters that we follow after we leave behind Marion are all very, very stock, very cardboard cutout. You have the detective guy, you have bland boyfriend guy, you have her overly worried sister. There's just nothing to him, whereas Marion was like a real three-dimensional character, and that made that whole scene where she first arrives and talks to Norman, you know, like the best scene in the whole movie. And like if there had been characters on that tier to sort of help us along, I think that you could still enjoy the movie just as much knowing all the spoilers. But the problem is Norman's our only interesting character left. And although I think he's a great villain, I think he's a really, really good character, the fact that he's the only character in the movie that, you know, is memorable at all after Marion dies is a big problem.
He also gets way downplayed after Marion dies. Like, he didn't have a huge role to begin with, but like that middle section, he shines incredibly brightly. Like, you basically just want to continue to watch this dynamic. You want to continue to watch him. And then basically he immediately afterwards goes back in his box to have the boyfriend, the detective, the sister poke around, and him occasionally going like, oh, don't worry about it. Ha ha, just kidding. And that's about all he says for the back third of the movie. The detective dynamic is at least somewhat interesting, but then the detective gets got, and Norman's role further recedes.
It's kind of repetitive too, because like, yeah, I agree. I think that the dynamic he has with the detective, because like what makes Norman an appealing villain, and this is what makes Hitchcock, one of the things that I think goes underappreciated about Hitchcock that we talked about a lot in my full disclosure, that we talked about a lot in my class that I took about him, is that Hitchcock, this era of movies was like the morality of movies and like heroes and villains was very much codified in the Hays Code, which is very important for this movie. And like having villains who were in some way like sympathetic or likable was not common. And Hitchcock was very good at doing this. And I think that Norman is the best example of that, in that Norman is still unquestionably our villain, but like he's also like a tortured young man. Like there's some sympathy in the whole like mental break he has like over his mother, his backstory with her being like domineering that they go on to explore and other sort of things. And even what makes that scene of him talking to Marion so great is that he just seems like a sweet, awkward little guy for most of that conversation, but then like you can tell that there's like, you know, there's something's not quite right there. Like he's still got that hint of creepiness, but you know, even if as written Hitchcock's other villains aren't as sympathetic as Norman, they usually have something about them that makes them more likable than your average, say, like Bond villain or something like that. I think that comes across really well with the detective, where he's sort of like, you know, getting flustered and very obviously very not good at covering up like him and finger quotes mother's crime, that sort of everyman like aspect. But that dynamic basically gets repeated when the sister and the husband or the boyfriend or whatever come back, and he's not left with much to do in the meantime.
But even when that dynamic is repeated, Norman's role is still downplayed in favor of letting the sister go wander around the house. And so, like, I think one of the most memorable scenes in that section is when he's sitting there tapping his finger that's really close to the camera. Like, that is a very tense moment. You can feel the agitation in him and, like, the frustration. And I would have loved to see some more build-up to that moment. but instead we get less Norman. We don't see that build up because Norman is such an interesting character to watch. The Anthony Perkins plays a very good role of getting him to that spot. You can feel the agitation. It's great. But as opposed to even seeing a repeat, we see a quarter of a repeat while the less interesting character is off doing less interesting things.
The other thing too is that, like, unlike other Hitchcock movies where this breaks with his like suspense over surprise philosophy in a big way with the shower scene, because that very much was shocking, and there's like a little bit of build up with like Norman creeping on her through like the peephole and that sort of thing, but you don't expect your main character to get gutted like halfway through. The thing is that in other Hitchcock movies, like, that Hitchcockian suspense, I think, is played, like, shot really well when the sister is running around the house and, like, she sees herself in the mirror and thinks that it's Mother, because at that point, like, as the movie is written, we are supposed to think that Mother is still a separate entity running around and killing people, which, just either because you've already been told or just figured it out through, like, osmosis, you already know that it's Norman. So that tension of sisters poking around the house, Mother could be around any corner, that doesn't work so much, when you know the whole movie, because you know that, like, there isn't really any danger to the sister in that moment because Norman is currently occupied by the boyfriend. And so I can see that working really well for a fresh audience in 1960, like, oh shit, like, don't go across that corner, like, Mother's gonna be there. But for someone who the role of Norman Bates as Mother is like so ingrained in pop culture, and like who Mother is, that whole section, that it falls a little bit flat in comparison.
I was not aware that Norman and his mother were the same person going into this movie. This was actually a thing that I was not prepared for. But once again, I very quickly pieced it together. I'm not sure whether it's something that, like, I had picked up at some point through some sort of cultural reference, or whether it just, in hindsight, feels very obvious, having seen other movies perform similar ideas, admittedly just better at this point. Again, no points off for being the original. Not knocking it in any way, shape, or form. Just we've improved since then. And I sound like I'm knocking this movie, and I don't want to sound like I'm just knocking classics for setting things up and setting off the trend. I'm not doing that. I just, watching it again, I know what's coming, and it's less fun, it's less interesting, and the tension is way less there because I'm like, it's Norman, he's in the other room. Why are we worried?
I think this is the Hitchcock movie with the least, at least of the ones that I've seen, and I do still like this movie, but I think this is the Hitchcock movie with the least staying power, partially because it's been iterated on, partially because it's so famous, what have you. But I think, weirdly enough, this demonstrates why, like, the suspense over surprise, like, impulse is a really strong one, and, like, keeps movies being interesting. Like, I was just as enthralled with Rear Window watching it the second time as I was the first, whereas I really actually like Psycho a lot more than I do now on my first watch through, but seeing it again, I was still really on board with the first half. I still really liked those characters, but the second half, at that point, all it had was, surprise. And surprise in a lot of ways that, without any sort of context into what precisely was so shocking, is going to be completely lost on us. I was actually thinking about Postal a lot during this, and
what a decision.
I will explain why that was in a minute. But Sean,
I think part of it too is, like, surprise can work, but the idea therein is that when you go back and rewatch the movie, you see little snippets of, foreshadowing, and you start to pick up on little details that set up the surprise itself, and, like, your increased enjoyment comes from other details that you hadn't noticed before. And watching this, I don't know that those really exist in this, because the first half is so distinct from the second half that there's not really a lot of setup in there. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't really see how that first half can lead into the second half for setup or idea or symbolism or anything.
Yeah, it's not that it doesn't work. It's just that I think you're right in that this is not the kind of twist where you you get that much more out of it on the second watch through. It's not that the twist is ruined on the second watch through. It's just that. So Citizen Kane is a good contrast. And I would also offer The Sixth Sense as an example of this as well, where if you know what's going on with Bruce Willis in The Sixth Sense, and you've never seen the movie, like I hadn't, I only watched The Sixth Sense very recently. Citizen Kane, Rosebud is a sled, like one of the most famous spoilers of all time. But as we mentioned in the Kane episode, that like in some ways that made the movie like more powerful, and that like there you could see like a lot of the aching like emotion at the heart of that twist. Ditto with The Sixth Sense. Like it was really heartbreaking knowing exactly what was going on in The Sixth Sense and watching it for the first time. The best twists are not only surprising, but in hindsight feel like the most natural thing in the world. And it's not that Norman being mother feels unnatural. It's just that when you're watching it again, it is more clearly set up to be surprising, because the character psychology, whether or not mother is overbearing as a separate person or overbearing as an aspect of his psyche, it doesn't really change what we understand about Norman as a character. We still know that like he gets jealous, like mother gets jealous, and like the sexual like activity or perceived like sexual activity of other women like sends him into a frenzy because he's repressed and has been controlled by his mother like his whole life. And you get that even when he's like creeping on her through the peephole. That's not something that him being mother makes especially gratifying.
No, it just feels like him being kind of a creep in an underlying way. And yeah, that's foreshadowing for him being a creep, but it doesn't add anything to the character in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't add anything to the twist. It doesn't add anything in any way other than to establish that, hey, Norman, kind of a weird dude.
Yeah, and so I think this is a good opportunity to come back to why I mentioned Uwe Boll's Postal, of all things, and that this is sort of the perfect counterbalance to that.
I never assumed that when we were going to be talking about, like, we talk about movies that we'll come back to, we're happy that we've watched, and will be like a solid touchstone for us, even if we didn't necessarily particularly care for them or love them. I really thought just the entirety of Uwe Boll month would be in the category of we will never talk about it again.
This, to be fair, this is probably the last time, if only because it's been so recent, and this is like the perfect counterexample. So the thing about Postal that I said, like the only thing for me that made it even slightly more interesting than Alone in the Dark was that it made me think about the role of like shocking arts and like what kind of role it can or should play. And Postal, as we said, was pedestrian. It was obvious. It was so clear. It was naked in its attempt at what it was going to do.
It was also naked at points.
Bro. But this movie, on the other hand, was genuinely pushing a lot of boundaries, and did so successfully that if you didn't know to what extent, you would never figure it out. Famously, I didn't. This is the one thing I actually don't think I knew until I listened to the Red Letter Media review. This is the first movie where they show a toilet. And in fact, apparently, she flushes the note down the toilet specifically because, like, Hitchcock wanted to push that boundary and made it so the toilet was essential to the plot.
No kidding.
Yeah, so that's the story. I haven't done any outside research, but like they were arguing about on that show whether or not it was apocryphal. But that's the thing, is that in the Hays Code era, there were lots of boundaries to still push, lots of unreasonable boundaries, and I think that's partly what makes the first half of the movie so interesting, is that the way that the movie plays with those expectations. And I think what makes Marion Crane such a great character is that one of the big things of the Hays Code was that promiscuity or like sex outside of marriage like cannot be shown, and if it is shown, that character has to be punished hard for it. This is like the misogynistic thing about James Bond in particular, in that, James Bond will have sex with an evil lady, and then she'll get her comeuppance for being like a bad girl, and that was kind of the Hays Code standard at the time. So this, Marion, even though she makes some decisions which are maybe morally questionable, it's understandable why she stole the money, but even so, she didn't do it for an especially noble reason. That doesn't mean that we as an audience are never not sympathetic to her. There's a lot of tension in those scenes, even knowing that she's just going to ultimately get gutted by Norman in the end. There's a lot of tension in those scenes where the cops following her around, she's making the deal at the used car sale, dealership, and that sort of thing. That she is allowed to be morally complex, especially as a woman. Pretty big deal for a film in 1960, and
it's very much the indication on how good Hitchcock is with suspense, because you know that those cops have almost nothing to do with where the story goes, but it's still incredibly suspenseful.
And that's what makes the first half still such a great watch, stuff like that. The other thing too is that you're pushing a lot of boundaries with this movie. And Hitchcock even, one thing I wanted to talk about was the trailer. The trailer for Psycho is very weird, and this plays into Hitchcock as kind of a colorful personality himself, like a public figure. The trailer for Psycho is basically just Hitchcock himself, dicking around Bates Motel and looking around, opening the bathroom door and just saying the bathroom, come see Psycho. It's totally bizarre. But that was part of the shtick, in that, Hitchcock comes and says, this film, I've made something crass and groundbreaking, by the standards of 1960. I'm not even going to show you a second of footage. I'm going to show you the bathroom. And I'm going to tell you here and now that I'm not going to let you into the theater if the movie has already started, because that's how important the shower scene twist is. That's how, Hitchcock went out. This movie is technically based on a book. Those poor bastards who wrote stories that Hitchcock adapted, those have all been completely forgotten by time. In the cultural consciousness, those are Hitchcock stories, and Hitchcock adapted a lot of things.
I had no idea that most of these things were based on books. Rear Window, Psycho, both of those, I'm wait, there's a book that these came from? I had no idea. So, yeah. Sorry, guys.
That's just how it goes sometimes. So the book, though, Hitchcock went around to bookstores near where it was premiering and bought up all the copies so people couldn't go read it in advance. I guess the author got paid, but I'm sure he wasn't too happy about that. I certainly wouldn't be. So so much was done to preserve the integrity of the surprise, and that he made such a public stunt, and it was part of his personality. I think that's part of what made Hitchcock special, just the fact that he's a talented filmmaker, master of his craft, knows how to do complex and subtle characters when given the opportunity, when given a good enough script. And the fact that yes, we can talk a lot about the problematic aspects of Hitchcock, especially with his female characters, but in his own right, the women in Hitchcock films do have quite a bit of agency in ways that were boundary pushing in their own right. So I think that this is all, in some ways, this is very atypical of a Hitchcock movie, but in other ways, this movie is the ethos of Hitchcock, which makes it so strange, and I think makes it more interesting in that regard. If the movie could keep the level of quality that it has throughout that first half, if every character was as interesting as Marion Crane and Norman Bates, and every conversation was as tense and as rich and full of, meaning and themes to pick apart, I think that I could easily say that despite everything, despite, the knowing all the twists, this is still a really great all-timer. And although I still think it's worth watching and I still think that it's great, I'm not filled with the same excitement I am about Rear Window or Casablanca or Citizen Kane, just because so much of the work that it did is already done, both for the genre and for like breaking new ground in terms of what is like morally and socially acceptable in a movie, that the act of watching it at that point, like once Marion's out of the picture, you're pretty much exclusively appreciating it for the filmmaking at that point, which is great, but it's not quite going into like my all-time favorite movies or anything like that.
I don't really have much to add, honestly. As I said, I ended this movie with an empty fucking head. I enjoyed it, but I don't have anything to really contribute this week, honestly. I apologize. I don't know. I've been in a rough headspace in general, just about like coming up with creative works, so that might have something to do with it. I apologize if you come to this podcast hoping to hear Sean talk about things. A, I'm sorry. B, it's not happening this week.
Sometimes this just ain't it, Chief. And I think this movie's hard to talk about. I think it's hard to, again, like, there's a reason I'm even stealing from another video that I just recently watched. You know, what can you possibly say about Psycho that hasn't already been said? And that's very true. Like there has been a lot of writing about this movie. There's been a lot of critique and a lot of discussion for very good reason. To the point where I think that the most interesting thing to talk about is the experience of being like, you know, millennial or Gen Z and watching Psycho for the first time, and like to what level the cultural impact affects your experience and to what level it stands on its own. And I mean, we basically talked about that. So I'm good calling it a shorter episode. 40 minutes is still a hefty amount of analysis. Y'all can breathe easy. You know, we're cutting the fat here.
Well, I think we should leave our viewers with some homework, just because we've mentioned this on previous episodes. If you're unfamiliar with the Hays Code, please go brush up on it. It's something that we will presumably continue to talk about on this podcast. And it's just something worth knowing if you're a fan of movies, or even not a fan of movies. I think it's a very interesting time period in America. It's probably worth reading about. Just go read the Wikipedia article. Fuck it. Who cares?
Oh, I also I have another bounty. Another one of my famous Jackson Keller shitpost bounties. So Sean, if you need something to do, here you go. So famously, the movie is regarded as, like, a lot of people don't agree with me in that don't agree in that, like, the second half is still really interesting in its own right, even though, like, Marion's not around. Like, you know, that's up to taste. But basically, it's universally agreed that the last 10 minutes of the exposition dump with the psychologist explaining the entirety of Norman's character sucks.
Okay, cool. That wasn't just me.
No, that was definitely like, all right, dum-dums in the audience who don't get it, here you go.
Here's fucking the Citizen Kane bird call.
Except way more egregious. You know what would make this scene exciting?
Do tell.
Is if somebody went and re-edited the scene to include the song that plays in the Danganronpa franchise when the protagonist is reiterating the crime in manga format.
Oh, beautiful. Absolutely. You're entirely correct. You know what? You got to spell it out for the dum-dums, and sometimes the dum-dums are you.
So that's my bounty this time. Please enjoy.
It's not even a hard one to do. I could knock that out in 5 minutes.
You always pull through for me, Sean. This is nothing compared to Thanos Yoshi.
Oh, God. Watching that again, I don't want to talk about that. We're not talking about that on the podcast. Go read up on the Hays Code. Stop listening to us talk. I've been Sean McKinda. Twitter, Sean McKinda. Writing 25 years later. Maybe other places soon. We'll find out.
And I'm Jackson Keller. You can find me on YouTube at Jackson Keller. I've got the Dark Lord's got a new approach. So in addition to Horsecast episodes, there might be a little something.
Ooh. Ooh, I'm excited. I have not heard what might be coming up here.
Yeah,
so,
I forgot to mention in the pre-discussion. I'll tell you in a minute.
I'm excited. I get some behind the scenes information. If you want to keep in contact with the podcast, at BADHcast, at BADH_cast on Twitter. If you want to yell at Jackson and I, you can join our Discord, and the way to do that is by signing up at our Patreon at only $1 a month at patreon.com/BADHcast. You get access to our Discord. $5 a month gets you access to our Discord and a backlog of bonus episodes. We got some serious Stone Cold bangers on there. We did the road last month, which was a fascinating read. Yes, I almost said The Room. Don't worry about
you better be keeping that cut in here.
And at $10 a month, you get access to all that. And you can make requests for upcoming bonus episodes, which, speaking of, we need a bonus episode for this month. So please, if you are a $10 patron, let us know what you want to hear from us. We'll take care of it. You also get a little something something.
Thank you so much, Julia, Travis, Pat, Autumn Keller, my mother, yes indeed, and Summer, my aunt, yes indeed. Thank you all.
A couple weeks ago, I made a comment that, like, this is eventually going to boil over into some sort of actual joke. That wasn't it.
This ain't it, Chief.
Also, thanks for Lords the Highway for the use of our theme song. It is Suicide, alternate take off the album High Octane and Low Expectations. They're a wonderful band. You should go check them out wherever you can. Stream their music, support them however you want, buy it, all that good stuff. Also, thanks to 25yearslaterstate.com. There's a little button of us in the bottom of their website, but you should also go read the stuff that people are writing on there. There's a bunch of really talented people doing a bunch of really talented writing that you should definitely check out. Next week is Vertigo. Let's see if Sean's it's good streak continues. I really hope I like it more.
Find out on the next exciting episode. I love Vertigo, so I'll be happy.
Bye.
Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go